The sun had already burned away what little mercy the morning offered. By midday, the town lay quiet, boards creaking under the heat, saddle leather shifting, dust curling in the slow ribbons. Somewhere in the silence came a new sound, the drag of chain through dirt, heavy and metallic, a sound that belonged to punishment. Before we dive into this tale, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of the Wild West. Your support keeps these frontier voices alive, and it lets us keep riding into the dust where stories like this were born. At the edge of the general store's porch, Ruben Harlo leaned his weight against a timber post, arms folded beneath the long line of a black duster. He looked like the desert had carved him itself, face lined by sun, eyes sharp beneath a brim that shaded little, boots worn thin from miles behind a rifle. He had no business in town beyond salt, leather straps, coffee, and nothing more. People weren't part of his life anymore. 5 years gone since he walked away from bounty work. 5 years since too much blood stained his hands. 5 years since silence became the only company he trusted. But silence didn't last, not today. The crowd gathered first in murmurs, porch boards groaning as bodies pressed close to watch. Ruben didn't turn quick. He'd learned not to, too many years where quick movements meant bullets. But the rattle of iron made his jaw tighten, and instinct pulled his eyes toward the street. There she was. A horse led the procession, deputy in the saddle, chain clinking from horn to collar. Shackled hands clutched at the length, pulling her forward. Bare feet stumbled through dirt, knees scraped raw, shoulders burned red by sun. The dress she wore was little more than tatters, torn down seams that once held modesty. Strands of dark hair clung wet to her bruised face, a split lip glistening in the light. Her name, whispered among the crowd, was Isla Gray. 24. No husband, no kin. Worked at the livery as a cleaner, kept quiet, lived smaller than most. But quiet didn't shield her when a man cornered her behind the saloon, tried to take what wasn't his. She had carried a knife in her boot and she used it, not to kill, only to survive. But the man bore the wrong blood, nephew of a councilman, and in towns like this, law bent to the weight of coin. The street didn't roar. It never did. That was worse. Judgment lived in silence and smirks, in spit at her feet, in the way nobody stepped forward. Boys tossed stones near her ankles just to see her flinch. Men muttered that she should have kept her mouth shut. Women shook their heads like they'd already counted her gone. Ruben's eyes caught hers for half a breath. Enough. He saw the layers. Fear clamped tight under anger, disbelief gnawing at the edges, but most of all resignation. That hollow look of someone who had stopped, expecting help. He knew it because he had carried it once, chains of his own. Different war, different dust, but the same weight in the bones. Inside, something in him twisted. He didn't like it, didn't want it. A man like him had sworn off causes, sworn off choosing sides. But the sound of those chains was louder than his silence. The sheriff brought her to the post in the square, the one used for drunks and thieves. They raised her arms, locked her collar high, left her swaying, knees bleeding, dress slipping. "Oh, council will decide by nightfall," the sheriff muttered, already sweating. "Jail, maybe worse." The crowd drifted slow and satisfied, leaving her in the open like some lesson nailed to wood. Ruben stepped down from the porch, not fast, not rushed. He moved with the same steady weight that had carried him through gunfights and ambushes. Purpose, not haste. The sheriff saw him coming. Didn't expect you today, Harlo. Ruben didn't answer. He pulled a leather pouch from inside his coat and handed it out. The sheriff frowned at the coins, weighing them. She ain't a prisoner. Not official. Just town business. Ruben waited. His face gave nothing. You're not buying her, the sheriff muttered more to himself. Just want her out of here. He sighed, knowing better than to test a man who never wasted words. Fine, Boam. The deputy shifted uneasily. Council won't like it. They can speak to me direct, the sheriff snapped back. Ruben crouched at Andala's side. Her eyes flared with suspicion, disbelief, still waiting for the catch, for the hand that would take instead of give. He opened his satchel, drew out a small iron tool and set to work. The locks fought him, rusted, sun-hot, but he didn't rush. He didn't touch her skin, didn't speak. The last link fell free, and her body folded forward, too heavy to hold itself. He caught her gently. Inside, Isla's chest surged with shallow breaths. She stiffened in his arms, not struggling but bracing for whatever price he would name. But no words came, only the steady lift of his arms as he carried her toward his horse. Her disbelief was louder than her fear now. Ruben settled her sideways in the saddle, mounted behind, and held the reins in one hand, her waist steady under the other. She pressed rigid into his chest, still silent. Together they rode out of Ironwood Crossing. No one stopped them. No one spoke. The land beyond was scrub and stone, ridges carved by wind, dead grass clinging to soil, as stubborn as the people who tried to own it. As the town shrank behind them, Isla's body stayed tense. She didn't ask where they were going. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she thought it didn't matter. But to Ruben, it mattered. Every mile put distance between her chains and his cabin. Every hoofbeat was a vow he hadn't spoken yet, but already felt. He didn't know why he was doing it, not fully. Only that he remembered too well the weight of chains, and he couldn't stand to watch someone else carry them alone. That was how it began. Ruben Harlo did not speak on the ride back, and Isla Gray did not ask, for words were useless things when your throat still tasted of iron, when your shoulders remembered the bite of shackles and your knees still burned raw from stone. Silence carried them over the scrub, past thorn brush and dry gulches, until the line of cedar plank rose ahead, a cabin small, but built to stand against years of wind and solitude. And when Ruben lifted her down from the horse, she buckled, legs refusing the command of will, so he caught her once more. Not rough, not claiming, simply steady like a wall that would not shift no matter how the storm pressed. And he opened the door with a hand that bore calluses from work, not cruelty, guiding her into a room plain but ordered, cot against one wall, cast iron stove dark but waiting, shelves lined with jars that spoke of a man who survived by preparation. She sat when he pointed, winced when her bruises met the blanket, and took the canteen he offered with trembling hands that spilled water down her chin. Yet he did not chastise, only turned away to fetch a heel of bread, a tin with stew. And then, without asking for thanks, without demanding story or debt, he stepped outside and closed the door, leaving her with food, fire, and the strange unease of not being watched. Inside her chest, the disbelief pressed harder than the pain, for every man before had wanted something. Some took, some bargained, but none had given without claim. And she curled on the cot, clutching her knees, eyes fixed on the thin strip of light beneath the door, listening for footsteps that never came. And she thought of the half-second when his eyes had caught hers in the street, how they had not burned with hunger or pity, but something steadier, heavier, like recognition. and she did not know whether to fear it or rest against it. So she did neither, and let exhaustion carry her under. Though even in dreams, the clink of chains tried to return, waking her often until dawn crept pale across the cedar boards. When she stirred at last, the air still cool, her wrists throbbed, her knees stiff, her body sore in too many places. Yet the room stayed quiet, no boots pacing, no voices growling, no rope to yank her awake, only the scrape of metal outside, rhythmic and low like a tool worked against wood. And when she rose, she found bread and water left by her side, not as bait, but as provision. And she ate with hunger that made her chest ache. Then waited, minutes long as years, until the door opened, and Ruben filled it, shoulders broad, sleeves rolled, forearms streaked with sawdust and grease, eyes as steady as before. And he moved to the stove without comment, stoking fire, setting the kettle. Then finally looked her way just once and said, "Pump's working out back." Buckets there, his voice low, rough but free of threat, and she nodded, whispered the first word she had offered since the square. "Thank you," testing whether he would twist it into debt, but he only turned and stepped out again, leaving the choice with her. Outside, the sun rose fast, bare feet cold in dirt as she wrapped the blanket tight. Found the pump and basin, soap that stung, cuts raw, and she scrubbed blood and dust from her scalp until the water turned muddy red. Then rinsed the ruined dress, draping it on the fence before standing a moment, naked under the open morning, heart hammering with the fear of unseen eyes. Yet no one came. No voice ordered her back into shame. And she returned wrapped in wool, hair dripping, to find Ruben whittling wood at the table, lifting his eyes only to nod toward the drying cloth, saying, "Shade won't help it." And when she asked, quiet and testing, if he wanted her to leave, his answer came steady, "No." And when she pressed if she owed him, he shook his head, "You don't." And that was the end of it. The day stretched into rhythm then, Isla tentative at first, helping muck stalls, feeding the gelding, while Ruben repaired posts, hauled water, their silence not heavy like in town but useful shared. And as evening came, they ate stew at the table, her still wrapped in blanket, his gaze calm when it fell on her. And after he bedded down by the stove, she watched his face softened by firelight and wondered what kind of man built walls so high yet opened doors without question. And that night, for the first time since the alley, she did not jolt awake to shouting, for the cabin's quiet was deeper than fear. And when dawn came again, she found herself moving before him, stepping barefoot into frost-bitten air, watching the ridge glow gold, and realizing that though she had not chosen this path, she had chosen to stay another day. By the third morning, the rhythm between them had begun to feel less like accident, and more like something that belonged, though neither Ruben nor Isla named it. She rose early, bare feet brushing against the cool floorboards, and stepped outside with the blanket still draped across her shoulders. The sky pale with first light, the ridgeline washed in amber, the air cold enough to sting her skin, but clear enough to feel like breath she could keep. And when she returned, she found Ruben already awake, sleeves rolled, coffee steaming on the table, his eyes sharp though he'd barely closed them through the night. And for a moment she wondered if he ever slept deeply, or if men who carried scars of war and bounty work had long since traded rest for vigilance. Yet she said nothing, only sat and wrapped her hands around the tin cup. He slid her way, grateful for warmth that settled into her bones. Later, she took to the barn without asking, found the rake and feed, worked as though she had always known the rhythm of horse and hay. And when Ruben passed carrying fence posts, he did not order her back or warn her off, only nodded. Once, that simple gesture more permission than any speech could give, and by dusk they shared stew again, silent, steady, until her eyes found his across the table, and she did not look away, for she was beginning to test the truth of him, to see if silence could be trust and not just distance. And when night came, he rolled his blanket near the stove while she lay on the cot, her body still wrapped in wool, her mind restless with the memory of chains clattering against dirt. And she asked into the dim light, "Do you always live like this?" And he answered without moving his gaze, "Yeah." And when she pressed, "Don't you get lonely?" He gave her no answer at all. And that silence told her more than words could, told her he had once known companionship, that it had been torn away, and that now he carried solitude like a weapon and a shield. She turned then, facing the wall, wondering if a man so carved by grief could still be reached, if trust was something he even wanted anymore. Yet sleep came easier than it had in months, for no boots thundered, no fists struck, no voices demanded, and for the first time in years, she felt the steady rhythm of another body's breathing fill the cabin in a way that made the dark less cruel. By the next day, the question of debt still gnawed at her. So when she brought water to where Ruben was working with hammer and post, she spoke soft, "I want to earn my place here." And when he replied simply, "You don't owe me anything," she felt both relief and confusion, for men had always measured kindness in costs. But his eyes stayed calm as he turned back to the work. And that night, as flames curled low in the stove, she dared to speak her truth, voice breaking. "They would have let them hurt me worse, you know." And he nodded without hesitation. "I know." And the certainty of his voice gave her a strength she hadn't felt since before the alley, before the knife, before the square. Later, when her body trembled not from fear, but from the release of it, she reached out across the quilt and brushed her hand against his just for a second, and he did not pull away, his fingers closing gently around hers with no demand, no claim, just presence. And something inside her shifted like a locked door easing open. That night she stood near the fire as he rolled his blanket, and when he told her she could take the bed, she shook her head whispering, "I don't want the bed," and stepped toward him, her hand pressed to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded steady, her lips brushing his in a kiss, not of desperation or bargain, but of choice. Her first true choice in longer than she could count. And when he did not flinch, did not take, but let her lead, she knew she was no longer chained. For when they lay together, it was not for survival or warmth, not just the need of flesh, but the joining of two people who had been cut raw by the world, yet found in each other a space where neither had to run. She slept with her head against his chest, his arm wrapped across her waist. And for the first time in her memory, the night carried no echo of chains, no shadows of men reaching in the dark, only the quiet of desert wind outside the cedar walls, and the calm weight of knowing that when she woke, she would not be alone. And when dawn did come, pale and gold through the cabin window, she stirred beneath his arm, felt his breath steady at her back, and realized with a start that the knot inside her chest, the one tied tight by fear and survival, had begun to loosen. And though she did not yet have words for it, the feeling was simple, undeniable. Safety, not promised, not eternal, but enough to make her believe in beginning again. Morning light came softer now, Not the harsh blaze that burned chains into skin, but a gentler wash that slid across the cedar boards and found Isla sitting near the fire, Ruben's shirt loose over her shoulders, her hair still damp from the pump. She had risen early, restless with a new calm she didn't yet trust. And when Ruben stepped in from the yard, boots dusted, axe balanced against his shoulder, she watched him, the way a woman studies weather, knowing the silence of a man can be storm or shelter. And though he set the wood down without speaking, the weight in the room shifted when hoofbeats cracked across the stillness, steady and certain, a rider approaching from the south. Isla froze in the doorway of the barn, her hands gripping the frame as the horse drew closer, dust curling around the rider's boots. And when Ruben emerged from the tree line with the axe still in his grip, his frame squared not in surprise, but in preparation. She saw in him a man who had measured threats before, a man who knew exactly how far to stand from a stranger. The rider dismounted, clean clothes and a polished vest too fine for this country, and introduced himself as Bryce Denon, voice slick with town council polish, a man who had come not for supplies, but for control. His words danced with concern. The girl's charges may be cleared, but people worry about precedent. And though Isla stayed half hidden in shadow, her stomach nodded, for she had learned long ago that polite words often masked crueler blades. Ruben's face did not shift, only his stance one slow step forward that made Bryce swallow, and his reply was cold iron. "You saying I broke a law?" Bryce lifted his hands, smiled thin, pretended peace. But the desert wind carried no softness, and when Ruben told him plain, "You come out here again, you better bring a badge or a shovel," the silence that followed was sharper than any gun drawn, Bryce retreating with muttered farewells and tight reins on his horse. When he was gone, Isla stepped out, her voice thin with nerves, though she hated that weakness, asking if the man would return. And Ruben answered with the steady calm of someone who had faced down worse. "Maybe. Doesn't matter that." Night, as the moon rose, she boiled beans with fatback, setting the pot on the stove like she belonged there. And when they ate side by side, the rhythm felt less like chance and more like a choice shaping itself. After supper, she sat on the porch steps, eyes lifted to coyotes, singing across the ridge. And Ruben joined without a word, his body warm beside hers, his scent wood smoke and sweat. And she asked softly, "You always been like this? Quiet, alone?" And his silence stretched long before he admitted no. Then added with thumb rubbing his palm, "Lost someone a long time ago. Didn't fix easy." She didn't press, for she knew loss by taste and scar. But the ache in his voice told her grief had carved him deep. She asked if he had ever thought about starting again, and his answer was a quiet blade. "I stopped thinking about it," she nodded, understanding more than he said. And when she looked down at her bare feet on the porch boards, then at his scarred hands resting heavy on his knees, she reached across the space and touched him. Small, testing, and his fingers closed gently around hers, steady as stone. In that moment, the air thickened, not with fear, but with presence. And when night pulled them inside, she did not return to the cot, but stood by the fire, watching him unroll his blanket, until he told her she could take the bed, and she whispered back, "I don't want the bed," stepping toward him, placing her hand over the scar beneath his shirt, leaning up with lips that did not beg but chose. He did not resist, did not claim, but let her come, and when they lay together again, it was slower, steadier, their silence no longer a gulf but a bridge. each breath sinking with the other until the desert itself seemed to pause and listen. And when dawn broke, she rose first, quilt pulled tight, stepping into frost-stung air with bare feet, and realizing the ground beneath no longer felt like exile, but something nearer to home. For she had not only been spared, she had begun. And Ruben Harlo, man of scars and silence, had chosen her without asking for anything in return. And she, for the first time since the alley, since the post, since the rattle of chains through dust, chose him back. By the time the next sun stretched long shadows across the cedar walls, the shape of their days had shifted into something steadier, work moving between them like a language older than speech. And though no vows had been spoken, there was a rhythm that felt binding. Ruben at the fence line with hammer and post, Isla in the barn with rake and bucket, her hair tied back with the red ribbon he'd brought from town, both of them moving in silence that did not weigh heavy but simply filled the air like dust on the wind, a silence made of trust. In that stillness, Isla felt the tight knot inside her chest ease little by little. For the first time in years, she could work without eyes burning into her back, without waiting for hands to strike. And when she mucked the stalls or carried feed, she found herself humming under her breath. Surprised at the sound, almost startled that her body remembered how to make music when no one listened. Ruben noticed, though he said nothing, only glanced over with the faintest lift of brow, as though filing the sound away like a detail too valuable to name aloud. And in the evenings, after tools were set aside and the horse fed, they shared stew by the fire, Isla curled on the floor with blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Ruben seated solid at the table, sharpening his knife with the steady rhythm of stone against steel. And though they rarely spoke more than a handful of words, she began to understand his language. The way he left the kettle half filled each morning so she would not have to carry from the pump. The way he always split firewood smaller than before so her arms would not strain. The way he moved through the cabin, leaving space for her presence without ever asking her to fill it. Inside her, disbelief fought with a fragile warmth, for she had learned to measure every kindness by the price that followed, and yet no price came. Only small acts of care that asked for nothing in return. And it was in that contrast, between the world that had chained her and the man who offered her silence instead, that she felt herself loosening. Not fast, not reckless, but like a rope drawn slack after too many years pulled tight. She did not say these things aloud, but in the barn one afternoon, she whispered to the gelding as she brushed his flank, "I don't know how to belong without debt." And the horse flicked its ears and huffed warm breath against her arm. And when Ruben passed by carrying a bucket of water, he glanced at her once, quiet eyes meeting hers as if he'd heard anyway. And that look told her enough, that he did not need her debt, only her presence. Still, she could not keep questions from rising, questions that pressed against the quiet. Until one evening by the fire, she asked him, "Why'd you take me out of town? You didn't even know me?" And he looked into the flames, thumb rubbing across his palm in that slow, habitual way, and said only, "Didn't need to," which was not an answer, but somehow enough. And when she pressed again, "They would have hurt me more, you know." He nodded, steady as stone. "I know." And in his voice there was no pity, only recognition. And that single acknowledgement filled her chest with something heavier than breath. Later that night, while frost crawled across the cabin window, she watched him lay out his blanket near the stove, and a wild thought took root. Maybe she was not meant to run anymore. Maybe survival could mean staying. So she rose from the cot, blanket falling loose, and stood near the fire until he told her, "You can have the bed." And she answered back, "I don't want the bed," before crossing the room and placing her hand against his chest, feeling the slow drum of his heart beneath scarred skin. And when he did not flinch, did not claim, only allowed her to choose, she pressed her lips to his, not out of desperation or bargain, but because she wanted to, because the silence between them had become something living. And when they lay together that night, it was not hurried or fearful, but steady, two people broken in different ways, finding rhythm in each other's breathing. And when she fell asleep with his arm across her waist, she dreamed not of chains, but of open sky, of cedar smoke, of the sound of his voice when he had told her, "You did what you had to do." And for the first time since the alley behind the saloon, since the square, since the rattle of iron through dust, Isla Gray did not wake with a start. And Ruben Harlo, scarred by years of blood and silence, found that the weight of another's breathing in his cabin was not a burden, but a kind of peace he had not thought possible. The days that followed carried a new weight, not the kind that bent backs, but the kind that made a woman pause at the doorway and study the man across from her, searching his silence for what he would not speak. And Isla found herself watching Ruben as he split wood, as he sharpened steel, as he moved through the yard with a steadiness that was not indifference, but memory. And she thought often of the scar across his cheekbone, the one that caught the firelight when he leaned near, the one he never explained. She wondered if pain made men harder or simply quieter, and whether the quiet itself was the scar. One evening, while smoke curled from the stove and the wind rattled the eaves, she set her needle down and asked him outright, "What were you before this?" And after a long pause, he said the word she had already guessed: bounty hunter. And though her chest tightened at the thought, she did not flinch, for she had already seen in his eyes the man he was now, not the man who once traded coin for blood. Still, she asked, "You kill people?" And his gaze did not harden. It only held steady. Some needed killing. Others I brought in alive. And when she whispered, "You ever regret it?" he looked down into his cup, voice low, "Yeah." And he did not add more, but he did not need to, for regret weighed in his shoulders, carved into the lines around his mouth. And she felt in her own chest the echo of a truth she knew too well, that the past did not vanish. It simply lived inside you until you decided whether it would chain you or free you. Later that night, when he laid a wool shirt across her lap with the simple words, "Yours now. Wear it tomorrow," she touched the fabric like it was softer than cloth had any right to be. And for the first time since she'd burned her ruined dress, she felt like a woman again, not a warning nailed to a post, not a body dragged for shame, but someone who could claim what was given without cost. In the firelight, she dared more, voice low and tight, telling him of the alley behind the saloon, of the hand that tore her dress, of the knife she had driven into flesh just to breathe. And she waited for him to say she'd gone too far, waited for the judgment she had always met before. But instead, he said simply, "You did what you had to do." And the calm in his tone broke something open in her. For no one had ever spoken those words to her. No one had ever freed her of guilt by naming survival as strength. And she believed him, not because she wanted to, but because his eyes left no space for doubt. When her breath shook, she felt his hand at her jaw, thumb brushing the curve of her cheek, not to claim, not to stir hunger, but to anchor her, and she leaned into it without fear, pressing her lips to his again, slower this time. Steady, a choice made without tremor. And he pulled her closer, both hands at her waist, holding her like she was something more than the world had ever told her she could be. Later, under the quilt, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing the scar on her wrist, she whispered, "You don't ask about the things that happened before?" And he answered, "Don't need to." And though she told him she wanted him to know someday, he only said, "Whenever you're ready." And in that patience, she felt a kind of reverence she had never known, for men before had always demanded story, demanded confession, demanded surrender. But Ruben Harlo wanted only presence. In the dim light, she asked him in return, "And you? Are you going to tell me about that scar someday?" And he gave the faintest smile, one corner of his mouth pulling against the lines carved there. "Maybe." And the answer was enough, for in that moment, she realized the scar itself was less important than the man who carried it. And she drifted into sleep, not with chains echoing in her dreams, but with the steady warmth of his arm across her waist, and the unshakable knowledge that what bound them now was not iron, but choice. The frost settled deeper each night, creeping into the cracks of the cabin walls and whitening the fence rails until morning light broke them free. But though the cold sharpened, something warmer had taken root between Ruben and Isla, a warmth not of fire alone, but of the unspoken weight that passed between them each time their eyes met across the table or their shoulders brushed while tending to the chores. She had begun to notice the way he left half the quilt turned down before he lay beside her, the way he split wood into smaller lengths so she wouldn't strain her arms, the way a pair of soft gloves had appeared in her coat pocket without word or explanation, as though kindness could be slipped into her life quietly, piece by piece, until she no longer knew how to measure the difference between survival and safety. And it was in those small things that she felt the knot in her chest loosening, for men before had made her believe that every act came with a price, but Ruben Harlo asked for nothing, only that she existed in his silence. And it was that lack of demand that both unsettled her and steadied her, for she no longer lived in debt, only in choice. And that was a kind of freedom she had not thought possible. Still, the memory of chains rattled in her sleep. So she rose often in the pale dawn, stepping barefoot into frost-bitten air, her breath turning white against the ridge, her mind weighing the strangeness of not wanting to run anymore. Each day she worked with him in quiet rhythm, mucking stalls, sewing feed sacks, feeding the gelding, whose dark eyes mirrored the calm she was slowly finding in herself. And though no one said it, the cabin felt less like a place she was hiding and more like a place she was building. And that shift frightened her as much as it comforted her, for staying had never been part of her story. One night when frost silvered the window panes and the stove hummed low, she stood by the fire wrapped in the blanket while Ruben rolled his bedding on the floor, and her voice broke the silence like a strike of flint. I don't want the bed," she whispered. And when he lifted his gaze, steady as always, she stepped closer, pressing her palm against the scarred plane of his chest and kissing him, not out of bargain or fear, but because she chose to, because the quiet between them had become something she wanted to touch. His arms came around her, not with hunger, but with gentleness, and he held her until the trembling in her bones eased, until her body believed it could rest against another without bracing for pain. Oh, and that night they lay together under the quilt, her head on his chest, his arm curved across her waist. And when dawn came, she woke to the steady sound of his breath and realized the knot that had bound her chest so long had slackened, leaving behind not emptiness but peace. From then on, the days carried a new weight, lighter yet more binding, for she no longer asked if she owed him, no longer feared the price, and he no longer carried himself, like a man who expected her to vanish with the morning. She moved through the cabin with steadier steps, humming low as she sewed or swept, and sometimes she caught him watching her with a look not of possession but of quiet wonder, as though he still could not believe she was real. One evening by the fire, after the chores were done and silence stretched between them, she asked softly, "I don't know what I am to you." Her eyes fixed on the flames, her heart braced for a truth she might not bear. And after a long pause, he answered, voice low, "You're not a debt, not something I saved to feel better about myself." And when she pressed, "Then what?" his gaze met hers, steady and certain, and he said, "You're here. You stayed. That's enough." And though the words were plain, they sank into her deeper than any she had ever known, for no one in her life had ever said her presence alone was worth anything. She reached for his hand then, brushing it lightly, and he let her, his fingers closing gently around hers. And when he leaned in slow, giving her space to choose, she met him halfway, their kiss softer now, slower, less about survival than belonging. Later, beneath the quilt, her leg across his, she whispered, "I've never stayed anywhere before." And he murmured back, "Neither have I." And in that shared confession lay the truth neither dared name aloud, that for the first time in years, she was not running. And for the first time in longer still, Ruben Harlo was not alone. And though love was not a word they spoke, it was the thing they carried, plain as the frost on the windows and the fire in the stove, unspoken yet undeniable, and it bound them stronger than any chain had ever held. Winter pressed harder, the frost thickening into ice that clung to the fence rails and sealed the creak and brittle skin. But the cabin stayed warm with the quiet rhythm they had made, a rhythm born not of duty but of choice. Yet choice always drew the eye of men who mistook silence for weakness. And it was late one morning, while Isla was scraping old labels from tin jars and Ruben was hauling fresh wood to the porch. Enough the steady beat of hooves carried a rider toward them, the sound sharp against the frozen earth. Isla froze at the barn door, her heart lurching, for she had lived too long under the shadow of men arriving uninvited. And though she told herself she was no longer the woman in chains, fear still rose unbidden, curling in her belly like smoke. Ruben stepped from the yard, axe in hand, shoulders squared, his stance the same as it had been in the square when he faced the sheriff, steady and unyielding. And when the rider dismounted, dusting his fine vest, she saw the kind of man who had never bent his back to labor, a man polished for council chambers, not soil. His name was Bryce Denon, and his words came slick as oil. "The girl's charges may be clear, Mr. Harlo, but her presence here sends the wrong message," he said, voice smooth but eyes sharp. And Isla gripped the barn frame harder, her breath shallow, her mind dragged back to the post in the square where she had swayed with wrists bound, and men whispered judgment. But Ruben did not flinch, did not shift, only stepped closer, his frame casting shadow across Bryce's polished boots. And his voice came low, iron pressed into each word. "You saying I broke a law?" Bryce swallowed, lifted his hands as if in peace, muttering something about keeping order. But the desert had no patience for soft words, and Ruben's reply cut through the still air. "You come out here again, you better bring a badge or a shovel." And the silence that followed was thick. Bryce retreating with his reins in hand, his smile gone thin, his boots suddenly too clean for the dust they kicked up as he mounted and rode back toward town. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Isla stepped from the barn slowly, her body still taut with nerves, and asked, "They're going to come back, aren't they?" Ruben's eyes met hers, steady, calm, the way stone meets water. "Maybe. Doesn't matter." She searched his face, found no fear there, only certainty. And her voice trembled as she said, "You'd fight them." And he gave the smallest nod, as if the answer had never been in question. And though her fear remained, something inside her steadied, for she had lived too long under the power of men who took and threatened. But here was one who did not reach for her, who did not bind her, but who would stand between her and every hand that tried. That night she boiled beans with fatback and set the pot on the stove. And when they ate together at the table, the silence was not heavy but thick with the weight of things unspoken, things neither needed to name. Later, she sat on the porch steps, wrapped in Ruben's coat, her breath clouding in the cold as coyotes sang across the ridge. And he joined her without a word, his presence solid at her side. After a long while, she asked softly, "You always been like this? Quiet? Alone?" And he shook his head, his thumb rubbing across his palm. In that way she had come to know him. He was thinking of ghosts, and he answered, "No. Lost someone a long time ago. Didn't fix easy. She didn't ask who." Grief spoke clear enough in the way his voice roughened, in the way his gaze held the horizon instead of her eyes. After another stretch of quiet, she asked, "You never thought about starting again?" And his reply was the kind that lingered, low and final. "I stopped thinking about it." She lowered her gaze then, fingers curled against the coat, and whispered, "Maybe I did too." And for a long moment the only sound was the wind, until she reached out, laid her hand gently over his, testing, and he did not pull away, his fingers closing softly around hers. No claim, no demand, just presence. That night when they went inside, she did not return to the cot, but stood by the fire as he rolled out his blanket. And when he told her she could take the bed, she shook her head, whispering, "I don't want the bed." And he turned, eyes steady, waiting, until she stepped close, her hand finding his chest again, her lips meeting his with no fear, left in the choice. And the silence of the cabin became something else entirely. No longer survival, no longer just quiet, but the sound of two people who had stopped running, two people who had chosen against the weight of past and judgment to begin. The nights grew longer, frost thickening across the porch boards. Yet inside the cabin, the air carried a steadiness that had nothing to do with the stove, and everything to do with the rhythm that had settled between them, a rhythm of two people who no longer circled each other like strangers, but moved as though the quiet itself had bound them. Isla rose each morning, wrapped in the wool shirt Ruben had given her, bare feet padding across floorboards, worn smooth by his years alone. And when she swept ash from the stove or carried buckets to the horse trough, she felt less like a guest sheltered by chance, and more like someone shaping the place with her own hands. And Ruben, though he spoke little, left signs of his choosing everywhere. Wood cut into shorter lengths, gloves tucked into her coat pocket, half the quilt turned down at night. One evening, as she sat near the fire, sewing a new hem into her skirt, She found herself whispering into the stillness, "What if they come back?" And Ruben, stacking another log into the flames, said only, "Then they come back." And when she pressed, "You'd fight them." His eyes met hers steady, the lines of his face unmoved. "I won't let them take you again." And though fear still lived in her bones, her heart steadied because she believed him. The silence that followed was not heavy but full, thick with the weight of things neither of them had yet dared name. And it was in that silence that she shifted closer, her hand brushing his, testing. And when he closed his fingers gently around hers, she knew that whatever lay beyond the ridge no longer defined her. What mattered was here, in this cabin, in this fire, in this man who asked for nothing but stayed anyway. Their kiss that night was slower than before, less about the need to feel alive and more about the choice to belong. And when she pulled back, her breath caught as she whispered, "I don't know what I am to you." And his reply came certain, "You're not a debt. Not something I saved to feel better about myself. You're here. You stayed. That's enough." And those words struck deeper than chains ever had, for no one in her life had called her presence enough. And she leaned into him then, her lips finding his again, sure this time, steady as the fire that burned low between them. Later, under the quilt, her leg draped across his, she whispered into the dark, "I've never stayed anywhere before." And his voice answered low and sure, "Neither have I." And in that shared truth, something rooted itself so deeply it no longer needed naming, for both of them knew what it was. The days that followed carried the proof, for she no longer asked what she owed, no longer braced herself for demand. And he no longer carried himself like a man who expected her to vanish with the morning frost. She tied the red ribbon he had bought into her hair, and though he said nothing, she caught the warmth in his eyes when they lingered, a softness that surprised her more than words ever could. She boiled beans with onion and fatback, and he ate them without complaint, though when he baked biscuits himself, they came out black at the edges, and she laughed into her cup when her tooth nearly cracked, teasing him with a smile that had made his own mouth twitch, rare but real. They spoke now and then of work to be done, a trench dug along the west wall for cold storage, repairs to the barn roof before the snow grew heavy. And Ruben listened, nodding at her ideas as though they were not suggestions but plans already in motion. The quiet between them had become more than silence. It was a language, a way of moving that said more than speech. His hand on her back when she carried wood, her hum in the barn while she brushed the gelding, the way he set a cup of coffee down for her before she woke, strong and bitter but always hot. Each night when the frost glazed the glass and the wind rattled the cedar eaves, she lay beneath his arm, her head resting where his heartbeat steadied. And in those hours she no longer dreamed of chains or the square or the alley behind the saloon. She dreamed only of beginnings, of a life built not on fear but on choice. And though neither of them said the word aloud, both of them carried it plain in their chests. Love, not the kind written in vows or spoken to crowds, but the kind proven in small acts and silent presence. The kind that survived frost and silence and shadow. The kind that asked nothing but to stay. The first snow came quiet, not the blinding storms that would sweep the high ridges later in winter, but a soft blanket that turned the ground pale, hushed the trees and left the cabin ringed in white. And when Isla opened the door that morning wrapped in Ruben's coat, her breath fogging in the gray light, she stood for a long while, just watching the world change, her hand resting against the swell of her belly, as though anchoring herself to the life stirring within. Ruben was already in the yard, boots breaking frost, arms steady as he hauled the last of the hay to the pen, his movements sure, methodical, purposeful. And when he looked up, their eyes met, and in that simple glance she felt the truth they had carried through frost and silence. That what bound them was not the fear of being taken, but the choice of staying. The days that followed hardened with cold. The stove kept burning from dawn to dark, and each morning began with the scrape of boots on frozen boards, the hiss of boiling water poured into a basin, the smell of coffee bitter and strong. And though the wind rattled the walls and the creak froze solid, the cabin felt warm, not only from fire, but from the steady rhythm of two people who no longer braced against each other, but leaned together. Ruben and Isla moved slower now, her body careful with the weight she carried, and Ruben, without word, adjusted the world around her, stacking firewood closer to the door, mending what she would have had to lift, shifting the table nearer the hearth so she could sit when she cooked. Some evenings she caught him watching her, not with hunger but with reverence, his eyes soft as she sewed or stirred, and she realized he was memorizing her as she was now, not because he feared losing her, but because he had already lost too much in his life and had no intention of letting her fade unseen. When the knock came, sharp against the cabin door one frozen morning, Ruben was at the table cleaning his revolver, and Isla's hand went to her belly out of instinct. But her eyes did not carry panic, only care. Ruben opened the door slow, and Sheriff Lonigan stood there, frost clinging to his collar, breath white in the air, saying words that confirmed what Ruben had already suspected. The council wouldn't let it go. A judge was being brought in, a man with ink and law enough to strip Isla of her fragile freedom. But the sheriff, weary and pragmatic, offered another path. "Marry her now," he said, "and the law won't touch her." And then he left, as quiet as he came, leaving Ruben on the porch with snow thickening on his shoulders. When he came back inside, Isla was seated by the fire, sewing paws in her lap, her eyes steady, her body taut with the knowledge of what he would say. And when he told her the truth, she did not flinch, did not weep, only said, "Ask me right." And so he did, standing tall in front of her, his voice steady. "Isla Gray, will you stay with me? Be my wife. Raise this child here with me. Build a life." And she smiled slow, real, answering with the first unbroken yes she had ever given a man. And 2 days later, with snow falling light and the sheriff standing witness, they were wed on the porch. No guests, no papers, save the spoken words, but words spoken with truth, plain and binding as the frost beneath their boots. The months that followed carried them through deep winter, the cabin thick with warmth and work, Ruben fashioning a cradle of cedar with his own hands, Isla moving slower, with her belly round, her steps cautious, but her eyes bright with something she had not felt in years, hope. And though the wind howled and the world pressed cold against the walls, inside was a quiet not of survival, but of belonging. She tied the red ribbon into her hair each morning, and Ruben kept the stove burning late into the night. And when she stirred restless, he stirred with her, his arm a steady weight across her middle, his breath steady at her back. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt carried not by fear, but by love, not the kind written on paper, but the kind built in silence, in small acts, in steady presence. When the labor began, it stretched long into hours, her body racked with the force of it, sweat beading at her brow, her hand crushing Ruben's, until his knuckles burned. But he did not pull away, did not leave, sat beside her through every moment, wiping her forehead, whispering when she needed words, staying silent when silence was stronger. And when the cry finally broke out, raw and new, he cut the cord with a steady hand, wrapped the child in cloth Isla had stitched herself, and placed the girl into her arms. Isla lay back, drained, smiling through tears she didn't bother to hide, whispering, "Grace. We'll call her Grace because we never asked for this, and we got it anyway." And Ruben, eyes full, repeated the name like it was a prayer, Grace. And the three of them stayed that way for a long time, bodies pressed close beneath the quilt, fire low, snow melting soft against the window. By spring, the thaw came slow, the river stirring with runoff, trees greening late, but the cabin no longer felt like the house of a solitary man. It felt like a home, the cradle rocked by Isla's hand, Ruben stacking wood in sight of her laughter, the sound of a baby's cry filling spaces once silent. The council had gone quiet, the judge long since left, and the world that once bent to chains and cruelty no longer mattered, for the choice had been made, and it was theirs. In the end, Ruben Harlo, scarred by years of bounty and silence, and Isla Gray, once dragged in chains through dust, had built a life not of survival, but of belonging. And in the soft breath of their daughter, in the warmth of the cabin that no frost could silence, they found what neither had dared to name until now, family.